Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 9 o'clock Central Daylight Time, where I'm currently located, 10 o'clock Eastern. I am Chris Weave. I am here on Starfleet Tactical with my brother, DeLon. Some of you will recognize this as DeLon's basement. And I also have Chris Carlson here. So Chris and I have been talking naval stuff all week and then off and on. And I said, hey, how'd you like to be on the show? So he can tell you all where I said stuff that was wrong, because that's good. It's, you know, I don't ever have any problem with somebody telling me that I got something factually incorrect. In fact, I'd rather somebody come and tell me, in case you all haven't figured out in the group of Pat and I'm the extrovert, which is why I ended up being the guy that always launches the show. And so I'm the extrovert storyteller something. So trust me, if I'm telling something wrong, stop me soon, because otherwise I will tell the entire planet the wrong thing eventually if you give me enough time to do it. And so there's a few things that I got wrong the last couple of episodes, I think. Details here and there, although for some of them I still want to pull the thread on, because I'm not sure that I don't know why the source that I was reading said what the things that they said, so I want to go do that. But before that, Chris, how you doing?
Not too bad. Not too bad. Trying to finish up my Naval War College paper.
Oh, okay. So this is the write-up of the presentation that you did a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm looking forward to seeing that when it's done. What's the publication venue for it?
It's going to come out of the Naval War College Press, not USNI.
Okay.
But Andrew and Ryan at the China Maritime Studies Institute are flailing to get their amphibious warfare capability book out. And that conference was 2 years ago. So you know, priorities.
Yeah.
Temporal priorities.
Well, you know, that one's already late, whereas they've got the opportunity for this one not to be late.
Well, I haven't been given a deadline yet, so
that's not a good sign.
Yeah. And I went from analyzing 2 designs to 4 designs for each, for the 095 and the 096.
So Chris's thing is submarines. I mean, Chris does everything. But when push comes to shove, if he's the Jeopardy category he starts with is probably submarines. Is that a fair statement?
That'd be pretty decent.
Being a former submariner and all.
Yeah, bias. Okay, just plain bias.
Yes. So Wright points out that he was an amphib gunner's mate aboard USS Austin back in the 80s. So, and Wright also has a story about the time. I believe he has a story about the time he shot himself, which came out in a previous episode, which basically boils down to you should get enough sleep when you're on watch.
Yes.
So I had a little bit of an eventful week. A bunch of you who are here, so a bunch of the usual suspects who follow me on Facebook, already saw the picture. So the final box score in the end is I'm fine, but the car and the deer are dead. So this all happened Thursday morning at about 4:45 in the morning, as I was heading east on Interstate 80 in between the towns of Newton and Grinnell in Iowa. It's about 40 miles from where I am right now. And I was heading back to Dayton, and I'm driving along and don't have a care in the world. And then deer wham. I did manage to stand on the brakes for a split second beforehand. And I apparently took enough speed off, and the deer was small enough that my airbags didn't deploy. But the official cost to repair estimate from Geico came back at like $17,000. And they said, yeah, we're just going to total it out.
No kidding.
Yeah. So, well, it's funny because about a year ago in COVID, used cars were so hard to get and parts were so hard to get that the new car supply was so hard to get that they were actually repairing vehicles that previously they would have just written off. And so I sort of looked at it and went, yeah, 4 years ago, this would have been a total write-off. I'm not sure what it's going to be today. But they wrote it off. I mean, this all happened about 5 o'clock in the morning. I got towed 3.5 hours later, and it was a 45-minute drive. So the Geico people didn't get to it in the afternoon, and by close of business on Thursday, they had said, yeah, we're totaling the car. You're done. And then yesterday morning, I went and bought a new car, and I'm just waiting for the bank to send the money over so that I can pick it up. So I walked into the car dealership and they said, what are you looking for? And I said, a silver 2019 Nissan Altima with 45,000 miles on it. And they went, that's very specific. And I said,
quite. How close did you get?
I got a 2021 Nissan Altima that looks identical. In fact, when I'm doing the test drive, the guy says to me, because when I get in the car and I'm sort of like, okay, I'm checking where everything is. It's like, yeah, it's all the same. It's all the same. He said, I don't really have anything to say to you about this car, do I? And I said, no, you really don't. And so we took it out and did a quick drive, and handles just like the previous one did. I upgraded to not having a sunroof because as a tall person, sunroofs are just something that makes me slouch.
Yep.
So I'm going to be in town for a little bit of time. Called the apartment manager and said, yeah, just to let you know, I'm going to be out for a little bit longer. Keep the guard dogs around my apartment. Not that there's anything in my apartment. It's like, please come and steal my stuff. Just means I won't have to move it. Everything I care about is in the storage locker. So that was my entertaining. That's why I'm here instead of being in Dayton, because I came back to Des Moines, and I've got a nephew who's graduating from high school on Saturday. I was going to go to Springfield, Illinois on Friday anyway. Doesn't make any sense to drive 9 hours to Dayton to then turn around like 2 days later and drive 5 hours back, because I probably won't be able to pick up the car until Wednesday. So it doesn't make any sense so I got my work laptop with me. I'll just work from here. Yeah. Jen says sunroofs are an engineered hole in your roof waiting to leak. Yeah. And that's true. It's, even if it doesn't leak though, it takes about 1.5 inches, and I'm tall enough that 1.5 inches of less headroom means that I adjust my seat differently. So, but oh well. Let's see.
Sorry. Well, of course now, my wife keeps looking at me going, okay, don't you be like your brothers.
Yeah, my brother Sean has had a couple of car accidents recently, one of which is not his fault, one of which probably was. So the totaled cars of between me and my siblings over the course of like the last 3 months is 3. So, but
and my wife keeps telling me that I should not try to repeat the pattern.
Yeah, don't repeat the pattern. Don't repeat the pattern. So,
but the peer pressure.
Okay, let me adjust some slides. So we were going to talk about. Let's talk about the Montana real quick, and get that out of the way, because that was the thing that I was specifically thinking of when I said that I got some stuff wrong, because I think I said on the show the other day that it was my understanding this was based upon a source that I read so much stuff I can't figure out where it was that I read it, but the source explicitly said 2 things that when I called up Chris, I could as we're talking on the phone, I could hear him flipping through books. Because as you can see in his background, he has many, many books. And so he was flipping through Friedman's, a couple of Friedman's books, and he's flipping through, yeah, that's Gartzka, right?
No. Yeah, that's Doolin Garsky's second.
Okay. Yeah, Doolin and Gartzka. And so he's flipping through books. And the 2 things that I said that we think might be wrong are that Montana only had 1 rudder, was only going to have 1 rudder because, of course, it was never built. And the second one was that it had the exact same propulsion plan as the Iowas. It was going to have the same propulsion plan of the Iowas, which was 212,000 shaft horsepower. I believe, Chris, you told me that That one of the books, is it?
It's Dueling Garsky. I think it's 172.
Yeah, 172,000 is what I think I remember you saying.
Because it's described as a slow battleship.
Yeah, and so
knots.
and the thing that I was reading, I believe it specifically said that, you know, it was going to be slower than the Iowas, but they kept the same plant, and that was enough to knock off on the top end, you know, 5 knots of speed. And I could believe that, right? I think I could believe that. But I need to go back and figure that out. I need to go back and figure that out. So Jen says that he's still trying to find the Destroyer book for Friedman, but if you look,
there are 2 of them. There's 2 editions.
There's 2 editions. The new edition says, I think, revised, and they've reissued. I think they reissued. They
reissued all of them.
Yeah, they reissued all of them.
They don't have the same covers. That's what's really screwing people up. But they are the Friedman series.
Well, it's what screwed me up. I don't think they're quite as well put together as the previous edition was. They have that sort of textbook type cover as opposed to having like a cloth cover with a slipcase on it.
Yeah, they're trade covers.
The trade covers, and you know they seem to not. Okay. Oh yeah, I mean I believe that your source said that. I want to figure out why this other source said something different. Now it's possible because one of the things of the source I was reading was going through like the history of the design changes. And so it's entirely possible that he read something that was a proposal, you know, one of the options, and was not the one that was selected, and treated it as if it was selected.
Well, if she had 212 shaft horsepower, she would have been closer to 30.
Well, so Chris is the engineer. I am not an engineer. So when it comes to engineering stuff, if I say something and Chris says something and they disagree with each other, you should believe Chris. Well, you should believe that Chris. You should not believe this. Because Chris knows more about that stuff than I do. Yeah, Jen says the new ones are copies, not as clear diagrams. I briefly owned a couple and then realized I thought they were all new editions. And then when I realized they were reprints, I went, and sent them back because
they also use a poor quality paper. That's why most of the diagrams seem kind of a little bit fuzzier, because the original set was on high quality gloss paper that had more clay content.
Okay. Yeah, the old ones are quite nice.
Very nice.
Were part of the back when I was living in Herndon, back before I became a naval analyst again. I looked at one of the shelves on this big bookcase I had. It was a 3-foot wide shelf, and it's got Conway's on it, and it's got all the Friedman books except his early submarine book, the before 1945 one, because I only bought the second half of the submarine series, and it's got combat fleets of the world and stuff. And I looked at it and I went, I bet I have $1,000 worth of books on that bookcase.
Yep. This is the second edition.
Yes, and I've got that too. I got that recently.
Norm made a huge error in here.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, let me finish my story real quick. So I looked at this shelf and I said, I bet I got $1,000 worth of books on that shelf. And I was wrong. It was $1,500.
Oh, easily.
Yeah. Now, that having been said, I didn't pay $1,500. It was the 1993 edition of Combat Fleets, and I got it in like 98. So I paid, I got it at a discount. I think I figured out the price of all but one of the books, and at least one of them, Ned Beach's big coffee table book.
Mm-hmm.
That retailed for $75, and I got it for $5, I think.
Wow.
Or $5 or $10. It was in a remainder bin someplace. So I didn't pay retail for any of that. Well, that's not entirely true. I paid the Naval Institute members price for some of it, but some of it I got at really extra deep discounts. So in any event, you said Norman got something wrong in the second edition, the revised edition of the submarine book.
Yes, yes. If you go in and you read how he describes me, he describes me as a commanding officer on a nuclear attack submarine.
You were an officer and you were in a submarine.
Well, he just thought I knew what I was talking about, so he just assumed. It's like, no, Norm. I wish, but no, it didn't happen.
That is funny. That is funny.
Oh.
So, all right. So I tell you what, let's go ahead and start. So what we're going to do, what I've been doing, because I don't know if you've been watching the show. What I've been doing is way back before I had the big medical crisis back in June, I had been going through some foundational naval warfare book papers and stuff like that. Then, we didn't do shows for a while because I was like down for the count. Then after that, TJ Zadlow came and spent a lot of time talking about Star Trek captains and admirals, and we did Battlestar Galactica and this and that and the other thing. And by the time it all finished, it had been like 6 or 8 months since I did those things. So I decided I'm going to go back and I'm going to do a recap. And part of the reason why I wanted to do a recap is then I've now got something that if I need to do a presentation on it, I can go and do a presentation on it instead of doing 3 presentations. And I've been going back, and now it turns out it's a really, really long presentation. So it's taken me multiple episodes. And today's the day where we're going to do, I was going to do sort of the science fiction wrap up of it. Okay, we've been talking about the development of destroyers and dreadnoughts. I've been talking about battle line tactics in the 1930s. I've been talking about, Trent Hone and the importance of doctrine and how the doctrine changed and how we did all that stuff and how all this stuff works. And now it's time to sort of like explicitly say, okay, let's compare this to some science fiction stuff. Let's see. But there was a quick question here from Wilhelm. Let's toss it out and keep it in the background at least. And that question is, why aren't Star Trek space battles more like submarine battles? I've got an answer to that. I've got a couple of answers to that. Do you want me to go first or do you want to go first?
Please, it's your show.
Okay. So my thinking on why they're not more like submarine battles is that submarine combat is mostly about information denial. It's about controlling what you do so that the other guy doesn't know where you are and doesn't have information about you, and trying to get that information about the other people. Star Trek is a place where Spock can look into this visor thing and a blue glow shines on his face and he can tell you what the enemy captain had for breakfast. And so from that standpoint, it doesn't fit. It also doesn't fit from the standpoint that torpedoes are about as close to a one-shot, one-kill weapon as you can get, in that if you get hit by a torpedo, you're having a really, really bad day. And even photon torpedoes in the Star Trek universe don't really have that quality about them. In fact, I was talking with Tom Pope earlier today, and one of the comments I made to him, maybe it was when I was talking with Pat. No, it was when I was talking with Pat. Pat's not here because Pat's off flying. Pat's in the business of high-speed aluminum tubing. He is off flying to New York so that tomorrow he can fly from New York and be the pilot flying from New York. So he's out flying around for a couple of days. But one of the comments I made to Pat is that, if you think about it, in Star Trek, do they ever miss? I mean, sometimes, but probably about 80% of phaser shots hit. And the Star Trek shields really work like armor. So I can't find a naval model that really works to describe, the more I look at Star Trek, the less it looks like it's a terrestrial naval model in space, because you almost always hit, and you sort of whittle them down to the point you have to like subtract off all the armor before you finally get to the point where you can score a critical hit. And that's just not how naval combat works.
Would the directions have something to do with it too?
The directions, what do you mean?
Well,
directions?
okay. Keep in mind here, unlike the other two guys here, I know very little about naval battles. Okay.
Yes.
But what I do understand is that the torpedoes out of ships and out of submarines are usually horizontal on bases, right? And how much changes can they make as far as direction from there? It seems like when you're talking Star Trek, you can fire over there, you can fire over there, you can fire down there, in any direction.
World War II torpedoes and before were heavily dependent upon which direction you fired them.
Okay.
That is a lot less true these days.
But is it that flexible like you would see in
these days it is.
Okay.
But that's
ignorance is showing through.
No. It's not an ignorant question at all.
No, but my ignorance is showing
No,
through.
no.
It's not. It's a good question. It's just not from someone who doesn't know what he's talking about.
No, and what you said was mostly true for like if you started in like 1935 and before, I'd say it's absolutely true. You could have a little bit of gyroscope stuff to do stuff. I mean, I'm sure that Captain Carlson knows far more about the
if you
development of torpedoes.
I don't know if Trent Hone talks about this as much, but if you look at torpedo tactics, when we were putting like 10 tubes on a destroyer back in the 30s, we were looking at large scale firings. We had very large gyro angles.
Yeah.
You could actually steer the torpedo, I think, up to 90 to 100 degrees off its launch bearing.
But back in those days, right, at that point, you're not talking about a homing weapon. You're talking about your ability. It's like throwing a curveball, right? You can do some stuff, but once it leaves the pitcher's hands, his ability to change his mind about where it's going to go is over, right?
Well, that's true for anything up through wire guidance.
You had acoustic homing.
Yes, but once you shoot it,
that's true. Once you shoot it, it's going to do what you told it to do.
Yep.
But once you get to acoustic homing, it will make decisions about which direction it should turn, as opposed to I was told to turn left, I'm going to turn left. So, do you have any thoughts about Star Trek combat? Or this?
Well, I pretty much really much in an agreement with you is that Star Trek made the decision to just assume that sensors were all-seeing eyes. Yeah. They saw everything. And I'm not entirely sure how, I can see passive having long range because you could get subspace distortion. Supposedly those are faster than light. Ranging becomes a little bit of a problem. I think the Honor Harrington universe does a much better job about dealing with what sensors actually work. And the Honor Harrington approach is, I don't want to say reminiscence of submarine battles, but it's really one of those things that you would call it's the epitome of the distributed battle.
Yes.
Where you've got multiple sensors, all their information, it's bearings, but it's all pulled together and processed, and you get cross bearings and fixes, and you start tracking. So that's different because we can't talk to each other underwater very well.
No. In fact, I make the argument that what makes surface ships different from submarines is that a collection of surface ships is greater than the sum of its parts. A collection of submarines is at best no more than the sum of its parts.
Usually less, because you can't guarantee that everybody's going to be involved in the battle.
Yes, and so if you've got, because of water space management, because of avoiding It's really easy when you're dealing with submarines to accidentally shoot your own guy. And so the way you avoid that is by assigning water space to everybody. You're here, the other guy's over here. You're not allowed to get, there's a buffer zone so that you're not allowed to get close enough. So if you add a submarine, you can cover twice as much area, but they don't really mutually reinforce each other. You start adding surface ships, and they've got different angles. They can do cross fixes. It's an exponential increase in capability with the number of nodes that you have out there doing their thing. Increasing the number of submarine nodes just means you can cover a larger area, but it doesn't really make you more effective. It means you're the same amount of effectiveness over a larger area as a general rule.
Yeah, well, the problem with putting submarines and surface ships together is that ship drivers react like Marines. They classify with ordnance.
Yeah. I mean, have you heard the time for a sea story? Have you heard the story about the exercise I saw that started off with a blue on blue 15 minutes into the exercise?
Yeah, you told me about that one.
Okay, so I'm gonna tell it again real quick for everybody else. So what happened was that there was a frigate, and frigates have notoriously small pipes. They've got, network wise, right? They don't have very much bandwidth, and so they didn't get the word that the plan had changed, and so the submarine was right where it said it was going to be. It was a blue submarine right where it said it was going to be, and the frigate went, oh my god, bulldog, and shot it. And it's like we're watching this on chat, and literally on the same screen, you've got the submarine reporting its position, and you've got the ship going, oh my god, and firing. And so this led to a discussion, though, about what the rules of engagement were, whether it was okay for that shot to be taken or not. And there was a disagreement about whether that shot was okay for the surface guys to take that shot or not. The submariners who were on board the surface ship, they were there as part of something called the submarine advisory team. They were saying like, no, doctrine says you shouldn't have, you were supposed to do a mother may I, and on that particular thing. And they said, no. If he's actually in his water, you can take a shot any place. You can take a shot outside the submarine's water. You can just do it. And I'm not getting into all the details for a variety of reasons, but there was this disagreement. And one of the submariners is a lawyer in his day job. He was a reservist, Andy something, and he said, okay, I'm going to go research this, and at the end of the exercise, I'll tell you what the correct answer is. So now, I knew what the correct answer was just because I looked at the people that were having the disagreement. On the one hand, the submariners were saying things like, no, it's in such and such a doctrine. Like they couldn't give me the paragraph number, but they could tell me where what the doctrine document was, and they could give me a title, and they had it, at least an approximate date off the top of their head. They were like citing doctrine.
As a good nuke should.
Whereas the SWOs, being SWOs, were saying, it is the lore of my people that I am allowed to do this. And, I love surface warfare officers. Don't get me wrong. But when I was at DIA, and I loved it when I got a new nuke who came, because it was, after about 3 days, they would come to me and they'd say, is there like some regulations that explain what we're supposed to be doing, that sort of cover like what our authorities are and stuff like that? At which point I'd reach up on my shelf, grab this binder, this like 2-inch thick binder, and hand it to him and say, I've been waiting for you to ask. Here you go. Read this. Everything's in there. And it had all the docs that you would guess exactly what they are, Chris. All the DOD instructions and everything else in there. And I had 2 SWOs that were almost like that. Well, one SWO that was like that, he was a surface nuke. And the other one that was the last SWO I worked with was pretty close to being like that too. I didn't work with him for very long, but the other guys were really, really nice guys, but they just think differently. They don't think in those terms. They don't think in terms of like give me the written instructions and I will memorize this stuff. So in any event, I started to say, going through Lautenschlager, Trent Hone, et cetera, going to talk about science fiction today. So we talked about Montana. I need to do a little bit more research to figure out exactly what the failure mode here was, other than I read something that doesn't seem to agree with Doolin and Gartzka. And I'm not quite willing to stipulate to Doolin and Gartzka, but I do think that, if I had to put money on it, I'd put money on Doolin and Gartzka being correct. But I'm going to pull the thread and try to figure out exactly what this was. That the idea that they would build the Montana with only one rudder in a post-Bismarck era sort of seemed silly to me. I'll also point out that Ryan Szymanski for Battleship New Jersey had a very interesting session, maybe 6 months ago, where somebody asked the question, if they had built the Montana, a bunch of people asked questions along the lines of, if they had built the Montana, what would they have actually done? What changes would they have made from what they learned during the war, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of interesting talk in there. So let's see. Let me find it. I'm actually doing Lissa's job for her, but that's okay because I just need to find it. Where did I put that? Oh, I'm looking in the wrong place. Hide current comment. That's what I want. Okay. So let me pull up. Thank you, Lissa. Let me pull up the summary, go through this real quick. So I'm going to go partway through this. We're going to get to a point. We're going to switch over to some slides that Chris put together, and then we'll come back and finish off here. Okay, so this week we're having a session. The next show after this week will be the 3rd of June. Because next week I'm in Springfield. Delon and I will be in Springfield at our nephew's graduation. And then the week after that is MarCon. So this is the last show until then. And then it looks like in June 10th is going to be a no. June 3rd will be a yes. June 10th will be a no. After that, it looks like it's going to be yeses until late July. I don't know what Pat's schedule looks like. So because Pat doesn't know what Pat's schedule looks like this far in advance. His schedule is going to free up a little bit because he's actually on final approach to retiring from the reserves. But he still has the airline job and they're a little short staffed. And so they're paying him a little bit more. Okay. At MarCon, I told you all this the last time. I'm running my own green room at the con. I'm getting a VIP suite. I'm going to be there on Thursday. A bunch of the Bu9 people are coming. And so the plan is that I will have a space that people can come and hang out in. If you want to bring food and drink, that's great because I'm not going to spend a whole lot of money on that. But I've got a space that people can hang out in. A bunch of my Bu9 friends are coming Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday night. And then Monday morning, people wake up in Dayton, wake up in Columbus, drive to Dayton where the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force is, and we'll all go together to that. So anybody who wants to be part of this, register for the con, get a hotel room for the con, get a hotel room in Fairborn, and tell me you are coming by sending a message to starfleettac@gmail.com. And so then we can sort of do all the synchronization stuff and exchange phone numbers and get on the same text chat, et cetera, so that we can have comms at the con. So if people can make it, that's fantastic. If not, hey, it is what it is. But I figured, I decided that it was worth trying this experiment to see if this was going to work. So if people can make it, that'd be great. Oh, and the other guests there, Andy, Joel, Tom, and myself will be there. I think Brian Haven may be coming in. Pat probably won't be able to make it. And I know a bunch of other people that are going to be there, like Merle Robinson from the National Security Decision-Making Game and a few others. Patrick Childs is a Bain author who's going to be there, and I hope he comes and hangs out with us, but I don't even think I've told him about this yet, so I need to do that. All right, so this is basically, I already talked about this part. Wanted to go through all this stuff again to sort of reset things because I want to start doing more naval stuff again, spin back up on that. And so finishing the summary of what we've done so far. And so this is what we've looked at. Tonight's going to be conclusions and discussion. But I want to start off real quick with talking about the Winchell Chung pyramid one more time, because we keep coming back to this, and because the thing that I've realized as of late is that this might work for World War I. It does not work for World War II. And if you look at some of the options that he's put on there, which are not, let's see if I can make those a little bigger by dropping us off the picture. Yeah, I'll do that for this slide at least. Some of those options that are there, like heavy cruiser, light cruiser, have no real context in World War I terms. Heavy cruiser especially has no context in World War I terms. Light cruiser is a little bit more ambiguous. Light cruiser was sort of one of those things that sort of floated around a little bit. But heavy cruiser was defined by the 1930 London Naval Treaty. Before that, there was no such thing called a heavy cruiser. If you said heavy cruiser to people, it would have been left to their interpretation. Once that treaty happens, heavy cruiser had a specific meaning. If you look at the battleship values, propulsion, the propulsion was, what did we calculate it was at, Chris, for the Iowa class? 10%?
10.6.
I'm sorry?
10.6%.
Yeah, 10.6% for the Iowa class. And propulsion was close to maxed out for that hull form. If you do the calculation that the Navy did to figure out the top speed for a given hull form, told them that the top speed for that hull form was 34 knots. And I believe that the fastest of the Iowas was clocked at 33. Am I correct on those numbers?
That sounds about right.
Yeah. Do you remember which one clocked fastest?
Not the top of my head, I don't.
So,
one point I would like to make when you talk about heavy cruiser versus light cruiser.
Yes.
In World War I, light cruiser was routinely used.
Yes.
But its earlier incarnation was the scouting cruiser.
Yes.
And the heavy cruiser kind of sort of morphed out of the armored cruiser category.
Yeah, it's cruisers are weird. Cruisers, the more you look at cruisers, the weirder they get. And so you had something called a light cruiser in World War I, but it was way different in terms of, because in World War I, it was more defined by what they were going to do with it than it was by how it was equipped.
Emphasis on cruiser.
Yeah, emphasis on cruiser, as in the ability to cruise. The other thing that people lose lock on is that light versus heavy, by the time you get to the London Naval Treaty, light versus heavy is not talking about the size of the ship. It's talking about the size of the guns.
Mm-hmm.
And so light cruisers could be just as big as heavy cruisers in terms of their displacement. It's just they had 6-inch guns or lower, whereas heavy cruisers had 8-inch guns, or limited to 8-inch guns. So heavy cruiser had like a 6 to 8-inch gun, whereas light cruiser had 6 inches or lower. And so, that meant that they naturally sort of devolved into being more like an anti-aircraft thing, or something that was designed to deal with smaller ships like destroyers. But they could be just as big as a heavy cruiser.
The Brooklyns were very close.
Yeah. They started on the same hull forms. I mean,
and the only distinction was 15 guns instead of 9.
Yeah, and cruisers are just, and heavy cruisers, that limit on 8 inches, there's no reason to think that there would have been that there would have been 8-inch cruisers sort of a priori in World War II if it hadn't been for the London Naval Treaty. I don't know what there would have been, but 8 inches is a weird number. for that, because they weren't quick firing in the same way that the 5 inches were. So you wouldn't use 8-inch guns as anti-aircraft guns. And so I suspect that if it hadn't been for the naval treaties, to the degree that there was anything that looked like a heavy cruiser, it probably would have had 10-inch guns or bigger, which you only saw come in U.S. usage in terms of the Alaska class, where I believe they had 12-inch guns, right?
Right.
Which, I kind of understand why they went with 12 rather. They wanted to have a certain volume of fire, and they wanted more guns. So they were unwilling to do the thing that sort of seems to me to be the right answer with the fire control of the day, which was to do like 6, instead of doing 9 12-inch guns, do 6 16-inch guns, or 6 14-inch guns, right? Something that we already had ammo stocks for, and wouldn't involve stocking yet another size of ammo. So it helps in the Star Trek universe when phasers are phasers are phasers. It does make me wonder about photon torpedo stocks and how those work. And, you can wave your hands and say replicators and stuff, but replicators are more limited than people think they are. They're not magic in that universe. They get treated like they're magic, but they're not. So, okay, Chris, I'm going to bring up your slides.
Okay, this is a good place to do it, I think.
And we concluded earlier that we might as well have our pictures up. So, all right.
When you look at Witchell Chung's little pyramid, and he's got weapons, protection, and propulsion on there, that gets into the big breakdown of how a ship is designed and built. So nowadays we use what's called the expanded ship work breakdown structure, and we put pieces into these buckets. So groups 100 through 700, oftentimes just called groups 1 through 7. That's the stuff on the ship. Everything else is kind of like overhead that they use for doing pricing and whatnot. And you can see from the list down below in the group description kind of what went into each one of these little buckets. The big one that we like to talk about are group 400 and group 700, because that's where the combat system and the weapons are. But this is sort of broken out kind of similar to what Winchell did. Can you go to the next one? So if we just kind of look at a historical idea, these are percentages. If you look at a battleship, and by the way, this is the Iowa, 1/3 of the ship weight is structure. 43% is armor. So this thing is pretty well defended. Propulsion's 11%, 10.6. Very little in control and communications. Back then, there wasn't a whole lot. And you'll look at the armament. People don't, they look at battles and say, boy, that's a lot of armament. Less than 10% of the weight of the ship. Light displacement, less than 10%. Now, if you look at a missile destroyer, and this is a Burke, a lot goes into the hull and structure. There's no armor.
Yeah.
Propulsion, the 200 group, it's pretty much the same. You have the same sort of thing when you look. You have a lot more in terms of auxiliary systems. You have a lot more in terms of command and control, because we have a lot more radios. We have a lot of satellite communications, data links. Auxiliary systems go up big time. Think of that mostly as cooling and hydraulics. Where you have more computer power, you need more cooling. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the Burke 3s are pretty much maxed out, is they had to put in more electrical to feed the radar and more cooling to keep it from melting. But look at a modern ship. Its armament, group 700, 4%. That's typical. these days. Absolutely typical. Now, if we swap over to a submarine, again, the amounts are pretty much about the same. Now, an SSN has a really big engineering plan because they tend to go faster. SSBN's not so much. We just kind of twiddle around and, and as they said, hide with pride. But look at the weapons load for an SSN, 3%. SSBN's got all those missiles in the back. So yeah, that really cranks it up. But you're looking at very small numbers in terms of weaponry. And that's not going to jive with Witchell's triangle or pyramid very well. Next. So after you start getting a design in mind, and a lot of times it starts out with just a parametric analysis, which is how much weight for propulsion, how much weight to do armament. And then you start drilling down and you get very, 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 very specific, like placements of pumps, placements of guns, and then you get your detailed general plans. These are two sections of an old Spruance class destroyer. And you can see the 5-inch gun in the upper one and the ASROC launcher. And down below, we've got the second platform, which means it's the second deck down from the main deck. You can see 2 of the gas turbines. This starts putting things in place so you keep the ship balanced. It's stable. This is something you really have to pay attention when you're on the water. Probably not as big a deal when you're in space. Next. On the submarine side, same sort of thing. Here's a general view of an Ohio with lots and lots of missile tubes, but you can see where the propulsion plant is back aft. You can see all the stuff forward the missile tubes. That's all accommodations. That's where the people live. That's where all the command and control is. So that's really small overall in terms of the size of the ship. And of course, you got the torpedo room up there. But you now start putting things in place. I think a submarine design is a good place to start thinking about starship design. One, everything is encased. And that's a good one that puts you in the right mental picture. Because I don't think we're going to see, I'm sorry, I don't think the spaceship Yamato is really what we're going to be dealing with. I think it's a cool show, but that's not quite where I'm going. So once you get your plans put together, then you can start building. Next, please. And in the terrestrial sense, we're limited by gravity. So a lot of places, you're talking, you can lift. Bath Iron Works with 2 of their big cranes can lift a 330-ton Grand Block. Some of the civilian shipyards can get up to about 600 tons. And the carrier cranes, I think, are almost 1,000 tons lift weights. This is where space construction has advantages. It's easier. If you build your hull and you build a lot of your components in space, it's a heck of a lot easier to put it together because gravity is no longer an issue. If you have to lift stuff up from the planetary surface, that becomes problematic because getting it up becomes difficult. That's why you see a lot of stuff, even with Star Trek or the Honor Harrington universe, or even in Star Wars, construction is done in space, and there are supporting infrastructures to get you what you need to build your ship. But they're still going to be using things like modular construction. They'll put together blocks and move it out there and then assemble it in some sort of dock or slip, as we would call it. And what that gives them the ability to do then is to make sure everything fits properly. You just don't throw in this big hull and then start stocking stuff into it. It takes 8 times as long to do that. So you want to build them in these modules, get everything put in place. You can see in this one here on the left, The pumps are in place. The pipes are in place. The electrical wiring is in place. Doing that outside a module or outside the hull saves an inordinate amount of time. It's at least 1/3 as long. Once you get in hull, doing anything takes just so much more time.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at spaceship design, my thinking is keep your thoughts on the ship work breakdown, because it's a good organized way of doing things. Think submarines, and then think your infrastructure is not tied to a planet in terms of being in the gravity well. You are doing everything. You're doing hull material smelting and pouring, casting, manufacturing. All that is done in orbit or in nearby, away from the planet, simply because it makes it a whole hell of a lot easier.
Yeah, I did a couple of discussions about modular construction, 50 or 60 shows ago. And there's lots of different ways to think about modular construction, like just the difference between now I'm drawing a blank. The Germans, MECO
frigates.
Between MECO and Stanflex, for instance, one of them is really a modular construction technique that you can go into the shipyard and you can do stuff, but it's not something that you do over the course of a long weekend. Whereas Stanflex was really kind of designed to, like, I can go in and a week later I can go back to sea with a new weapons fit. And then you've got things
that's not technically what modular construction's about. That is technically about what the Brits call cellularity or modularity, where
Yes.
you change things after it's been built.
I went through a whole bunch of stuff like that. The Brits are especially interesting in that at one point they just made a decision: we're going to make all the passageways wide enough and all the doors wide enough that we never have to cut through the hull. And it's like, yeah, you can. That actually, that makes sense. We should do that.
Yeah, I was on a Type 23 frigate, and that central passageway is, one, down low, and two, it's huge amount of volume that allows you to you can move gas turbine modules out of that if you wanted to or had to.
Yeah, and they specifically designed it that way because anytime you have to do hot work, you've tripled the cost and tripled the time, or something like that. I forget exactly what the multiplier was, but it was some. And hot work is as Chris knows, but not everybody else might not know, is anytime you have to use like a cutting or welding, right? Anytime you have to make a hole or fix a hole. And it also, increases the number of guys you need, because you have to have a guy on fire watch, because how many ships did the Russians set on fire with welding torches?
Yes.
Ships and submarines, they're really good at that. So,
but if you go back to Winchell's diagram, you can start looking at what a battleship looks like. So propulsion's about 10. Defense is about 40, but look where his weapons are. His weapons would tell you it's a police corvette or something like that. So his weapons line, I think, is off.
Yeah, and I should point out, Winch didn't come up with this. And the thing is, the units are sort of funny if you think about it, because, like, where's hull? You've got to have a certain amount of structure, but this makes the assumption that there's only 3 variables that you care about, when in reality there's a not independent variable, a dependent variable out there that isn't included in all this. You can't just say, like, the hull's going to be 40%, because it's going to vary under certain circumstances. You're going to need more structure if you've got more armor to hold the armor. And if you are, so does that mean that counts as part of armor? Like, does it count as part of propulsion? Because as Chris has pointed out, we had a little bit of a conversation before we started that the hull, you can think of the hull as being the way that it takes all the stresses, and that includes the stress of propulsion, right? The engines basically push the hull. And so if you've got all those things going on, where do you put the hull in this? So I'm still doing some thinking about the right way to think about this. It doesn't work for just to say that is the sum totality of the ship. That includes all the displacement. I am reminded of a comment that a friend of mine, Brian McHugh, made about Fletcher Pratt's naval war game, which includes this formula that you use to calculate a point value for the ships that are in the game. And it takes into account the displacement, it takes into account the number and types of guns, it takes into account the speed of the ship, a whole bunch of things. And you go through this formula and you get a number. And the Titanic is a decidedly non-negative number or non-zero number in that. The Titanic, with no weapons, has a very large number because for its day, it was a very large, very fast ship. So I was talking with Brian about this 30 some years ago now. And the way he phrased it was, the right way to think about that formula is that it's valid for the part of multidimensional ship space in which warships live. And so as a first approximation, I'd say this triangle only makes sense if you're dealing with certain types of ships. There are assumptions that are built into it that may or may not be valid for all time periods. And maybe if I squint right in the right way, I can convince myself that it works for a given set of time periods. I think it's a useful exercise to think about this. I mean, it sort of gets across the idea that there are trade-offs, but the trade-offs, you don't have a zero, it's not a 0 to 100 thing, right?
Yeah, because on a spaceship, I would think sensors, communication, fire control are big deals.
Yeah.
And one of the things they just don't talk about, because no one really likes to talk about it anyway, because it's not very sexy, is that anytime you have things that are under power, they're giving off heat. And a lot of your auxiliaries are cooling oriented.
And that actually reminds me of something I wanted to say about submarines, which is, there's every now and then you get a novel where somebody decides that Earth's space fleet is going to be that they're going to take some submarines and put some flavor of Starship engine on them. And now you've got a Starship, right? That doesn't work as well as people think it does, because submarines are creatures, aside from just the fact that they're creatures of their environment, right? Even if what you're doing is adding something on to replace their propulsion, they use the ocean for things. They use the ocean for cooling. They extract things from the ocean. It's not a closed system. A spaceship kind of has to be something that looks like a closed system. At least it's not taking in things from its environment, with the possible exception of solar energy. Submarines, nuclear submarines anyway, make their oxygen by bringing in seawater and then breaking it down. So that submarine construction, thinking about the engineering from a submarine standpoint, makes a lot of sense to me. That does not mean taking submarines and turning them into spaceships.
Now, you talk to a satellite designer, and cooling's going to drive them. They drive themselves crazy.
Yeah,
over cooling.
Yeah, I mean, satellite design. I think that satellite design is on the verge of being totally and completely reworked. And the reason why I think that is if Elon Musk and Starship is able to do half of what it looks like they might be able to do, I think it's going to fundamentally change some of the equations. I'm still learning about satellite stuff along those lines. And so I need to go, I have contacts in that field. I need to talk to them a little bit more about it. So in fact, I tried calling one of them yesterday so I could sort of say like, okay, it seems to me that X, what do I not understand about this? And, I was in a room full of people that were talking about this and nobody was talking in these terms. So there's something going on here that I don't understand. So explain it to me. But I haven't had a chance to have that conversation with him yet. So, well, the plan was I was going to finish up tonight, but we've actually only done a couple of my slides and we did Chris's slides and we had a very productive conversation. We should probably talk a little bit more about this stuff, but I think that I'm going to call an audible and not actually go through and do the rest of my slide deck tonight, because we are at the hour mark and I don't want to extend too far beyond that. If for no other reason than Delon has to get up. What time are you getting up?
3:45.
3:45 to take my other brother, Sean, to the airport because Sean's going off to on a brief little trip. So
Out of the country.
So yeah, he's got to leave early. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that about this that's an obvious thing to talk about at this point, Chris. Anything coming to mind?
Not particularly. I mean, there's things you can talk about later where you can expand on certain things, particularly when you want to talk about space combat, then you can tailor it a little bit more.
Yeah, I was talking with Tom Pope about this earlier today, and one of the things that I sort of talked a little bit about this earlier is that everything's sort of, when you're talking about warship design in the real world, you've got this sort of built-in historical context, so this built-in technological context that you're dealing with. In the science fiction world, you sometimes have to invent the context in which to have the discussion. How your drive works matters. How, you might have to have you can maybe make the argument that, especially in a situation where you have to have maneuver drives and large amounts of fuel, et cetera, that Winchell's triangle graph is much more applicable
to Traveler
or to some science fiction setting than it actually is into the real world, than it actually was at least, especially as far as World War II, right? I think the farther back in time, the more applicable it gets. But I could easily see a situation where a Traveler ship, between tankage and two different types of drive, you could end up with a third, 40% of the ship is dedicated to propulsion. I could easily see that. And you're having to sort of trade that off. They do some explicit trade-offs along those lines in that game.
And a battle cruiser easily got there. I mean, just on the propulsion plant alone, the battle cruisers were in the 30 percentile range in terms of hull weight or light ship displacement weight. So yeah, how fast do you want to go?
Yeah, I can believe that. And I need to sit down with a bunch of stats on World War I ships and sort of do some calculations. One of the things I did, Chris reminded me that probably the place to go look for some of the sort of conceptual background stuff is Norman Friedman's Battleship Design and Development, which was a book he did back in the late 1970s, which I have one copy in the 149 boxes of books in the storage unit. In fact, I think I have two copies in there. I now am the proud owner of a third copy, which I brought with me to Iowa, because I want to get a better handle on some of that stuff. For some strange reason, most of the people out there that talk about battleships don't do things like give you what the percentage of the total displacement the propulsion plant is. That's not really the way that the rest of the world thinks about this. But I think it's kind of important to kind of understand how all these pieces fit together.
Definitely would recommend Friedman's 2 books on the Victoria era battleships and battleships of World War One, because he's got data like that in there, because that's the sort of stuff you get from ships covers.
Okay. I'm trying to think. I may have the World War One book. I know I don't have the other one. I'm pretty sure I don't have the other one.
And Bert's book may have some of that for British battleships. Dunlin and Garsky certainly do for the modern World War II ships, but I don't think that's what you're looking for.
How about David Brown?
His articles, yes. His books, not so much.
Okay. I wish he was still around. I'd just ask him.
Yes.
So he was on a mailing list that Chris and I were on until he died, what, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, he was very much a gentleman. He was very much a gentleman. Liked his posts a lot. So he was what was it? Chief constructor of the Royal Navy, something like that. So
that's what he retired out of.
Yeah, so he knew his shit. He knew his shit. Okay. All right. So let me take a quick look through the comments, because I haven't been looking at comments to see. Let's see. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, none of which seems to be one of those things that Bob makes the comment. Satellite construction already has undergone a major shift, which will be realized in orbit within the decade. That's an interesting statement. I look forward to pulling the thread on that later. Let's see. Yeah, there was a comment that this looks like a sort of play balance chart. Olive said that the triangle looked like a play balance chart than an engineering realness, an actual description of engineering reality. I think there's something to that. I seem to recall having seen the concept of that trade-off expressed in a ways before Winch ever created the triangle. I need to ask him about the where he got the idea of creating the triangle. Yeah, I actually need to go back and check Atomic Rockets, because he might. It's been so long since I pulled that from Atomic Rockets. I don't know. I don't remember what the sourcing that went along with it was. So I need to go back and take another look at that. Oh, yeah, Bob said something further on satellites, equivalent to going from Battlestar Galactica platforms to constellations and many more satellites. Yeah, I can't help but think that we're potentially in an era where it actually is going to make sense to bring satellites back down, or it could make sense to bring satellites back down. I mean, it doesn't make current satellites aren't designed to do that, but if you find yourself in a situation where launch costs are relatively low, you might actually be building satellites that are more modular and designed to recycle the parts. Now, that is a naive statement on my part. And by that, I mean, I am not an expert in this field. I'm just sort of looking at it from the outside. But I am very aware of the fact that technological progression usually goes in the form of people come up with an idea that there's a new thing that happens, and it gets applied to solving an old problem better. And then at some point they go, wait a minute, maybe we need to rethink the problem from first principles, and they come up with a different solution. It's not just using the old solution, but better, but a new solution. In the example, did I have this conversation with you, Chris, about factories?
Don't think so. Oh, yeah. The tall guy. Yeah, that was us.
So because I sometimes, when I'm on a topic, I have a tendency to have the same conversation with multiple different people as I'm sort of pinging people about it. So if there's a book called Leviathan, Behemoth, I think it's Behemoth, that's a book on the history of the factory. And it starts off with like English cloth mills and stuff like that, and it goes all the way up through like modern factories. And one of the things it talks about is like early car factories were tall buildings. Nowadays, when you think about factories, you generally think about things that are spread out, but they used to be tall. So why would you build up, right? You have to move stuff up and down. You got to have elevators, ramps, all this other stuff. That takes up a significant amount of floor space of the total building. It makes the overall thing less efficient. Why would you build up? And the answer is because early powered machinery was generally, you had a big steam plant that turned a rotating shaft that you had pulleys wrapped around to power the power gear in other places, right? So you basically, you had a centralized mover that had this rotating shaft. And if you think about the geometry of that, for a couple of different reasons, the shaft is my understanding, Chris is the engineer, tell me if I'm wrong, the shaft, it's easier to keep the shaft straight, et cetera, if it's mounted vertically than if you're trying to do it horizontally. And if you think about it, if you're mounting it vertically, you've got a 360-degree access to that shaft. You can have pulleys coming off of it in all different directions. Whereas if you're doing it horizontally, you're basically limited to left and right.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more efficient to have it mounted vertically, and it just works better in general terms. And so because you're doing everything off of that central shaft, you mount it vertically, and now you're building a tall building. And so like Ford was making cars in 6-story, 7-story buildings. And they'd run the Ford, if I remember correctly, put the parts on the top, and the car sort of spiraled down in the construction process. Renault, if I remember correctly, started at the bottom, and you got to the top floor and you had a completed car, and then they drove it around a ramp on the outside of the building to bring it down to the ground floor. Okay, so they develop electric motors. And the first electric motors are just basically replacements for those steam plants. So you got a giant electric motor and you got a shaft going up. And at some point they said, what if we made the electric motors smaller? And eventually you get to the point where every device has its own electric motor. You don't need the pulleys at all. Once the pulleys go away, once especially that centralized pulley system goes away, why would you build up? And so nowadays factories are all wide and low as a general rule. They might have tall ceilings, but they're not like they used to be. So it's trying to remember where we started on this one. The general point is that as new technology, we were talking about satellites. As new technologies come in, the first thing people do is sort of like do the old thing with the new technology. And then they start going like, maybe I need to rethink this problem from the very beginning. There's that famous comment about when people talked about really, really cheap microchips, and somebody's response is, well, what are you going to do? Put them in doorknobs? Anybody been to a hotel recently? How many chips do you think are in the doorknob? So, oh well. Chris, any final thoughts?
No, just leave it open for stuff for future. That's all.
Yeah, and there's lots of good questions here. I think what we'll probably end up doing is that the next episode, which I believe, if I remember my schedule correctly, was June 3rd, I will finally finish the slide deck, and then we'll probably do a question session certainly shortly after that. At some point, maybe Pat will join us again. Maybe Alec will be able to join us again, and do like a question and answer show. So all these questions you guys had, I'll see if I can go through and sort of collect them and maybe address them later on. But if not, bring them to a future show, and we will try to get through them. And then at that point, I should be ready to start talking about future stuff going forward. At Marcon, I am doing a presentation that I have not yet written. I'm going to start working on it tomorrow, on fighters in science fiction combat. Because I've talked about aircraft carriers, but I generally don't talk about fighters a whole lot, other than to say, do they really make sense? Maybe torpedo boats make more sense, etc. The thing is that I was never happy with that as an approach, because I generally try to put everything in a context and come up with some metric to sort of differentiate. And so I'm thinking about, on all of these things, the first question is, what is it? So what exactly is a fighter? What are the attributes of a fighter? And I think in the case of most science fiction, ignoring things like Edmund Hamilton's Star Wolves and Star Wars, where apparently you can base X-Wings halfway across the galaxy and they just sort of like commute to the battle. Aside from that stuff, we're really talking about fighters in the context of something that's deployed from a ship, from a aircraft carrier equivalent. And so doing a little bit more of an analysis, a comparison of the attributes of the fighter compared to the attributes of the aircraft carrier. I think I've started that in the aircraft carrier talk, but I need to finish it in the fighter talk. And so I've got 2 weeks to do that before the con. So I'm going to get to work doing that. And so I imagine I'm probably going to do that on the show in the very reasonably near future, sometime in June or July. So, Delon, any final thoughts?
Nope, I'm good.
Lissa, do you have any final thoughts?
Hi. Do the things, do they excite? Yeah. We will see you guys in June? July?
June 3rd.
June 3rd. So June 3rd, we will see you. I apologize. I have a boyfriend snoring behind me. Or no, maybe he woke up.
So if I had remembered that he was asleep, I wouldn't have brought you on.
You're okay. But yeah, my birthday is the 27th, so I'm kind of glad that we're not having a session then.
Well, happy birthday if I don't remember to tell you then. So congratulations. So, all right. So
if I remember correctly, she's a youngin too.
Yeah, she's a youngin.
I'm 31 at the end of the month.
Wasn't that?
Thank you, right?
I'm sorry.
Don't give my producer too much.
No,
shit.
I'm not giving it too much.
You're good.
All right.
I can say she's half my age.
I just remember how much crap I got from the people I work with when I was complaining about turning 35 20 years ago.
Yeah, it only gets worse. It only gets worse.
Look, I've got children in my life now. So like that's been interesting. It's like they're talking about these things and I'm like, you do realize that like Pokemon came out when I was your age, right? And they're like, you're so old.
Can I throw a story in like that?
Sure.
My daughter, who is now 21, about to turn 22, when she was making the argument to get a cell phone for the first time, first off, the argument was, well, all my friends have cell phones. Why can't I have one? And we were looking for, give us a real good reason as to why you should have a cell phone. And eventually we came up with the reason of she's doing a lot of sports and we're going to have to leave her at practices and stuff like that. And she needs some way of getting a hold of us and all that.
That's why I got my first cell phone, because I was doing track in 8th grade and mom and dad needed a way to get a hold of me at meets.
Yep, that's the same sort of thing. So, but at some point in time when she was trying to make the argument for us to give her one, I looked at her and I said, how old do you think I was when I got my first phone? Because she made it sound like, well, cell phones have been around forever and whatnot. And she's like, I don't know, what, about 16? And I'm like, how about 36?
Yeah.
And she was like, And I mean, you could almost see the synapses going off
She
where she
went-
was trying to figure out
She
that.
just went tilt.
Yeah, it's like, how could you not have had a cell phone until you were 36 years old?
It's
Is
that
even
meme with all the
possible?
equations on the screen and the lady going,
Yeah. I learned to type on a manual typewriter.
I never learned to type. Not really.
I got it. I know how to use a manual.
I do it.
typewriter.
I do an advanced typing pack, and I'm in the IT industry.
In fact, sometimes people will comment to me, and I've been known to comment to other people as I watch them use their computer. It's like, you learned to type on a typewriter, and it was probably a manual, wasn't it? It's like, yeah.
Oh, Mom, our mother learned on a manual, so she'd get on her computer and she's just pounding away on it. It's like, Mom, ease up, please. You're gonna break the damn thing.
Rachmaninoff.
what you need to do is get her a manual, like the manual keyboards.
My first computer was an NEC PC 8201A. It had the same guts as the Radio Shack Model 100. It had a 8x40, 8 lines by 40 characters across, LCD screen that only did text. I got it boosted up so that it had 2 memory banks in it. Each memory bank had, wait for it, 32K of storage.
Yeah, no, this has more processing power than my first computer.
Oh, easily. This has more processing power than my first 5 or 6 computers combined.
This has more processing power than what it took to take them into the moon and back.
Yeah.
Yep.
So one quick thing about taking men to the moon, and then we probably should let Lisa go. There's a guy that works at NASA, Goddard, I think, that occasionally shows up at science fiction conventions with an Apollo guidance computer. So he's got the pieces of one, so you can actually hold a piece of an Apollo computer in your hand. And he's got a presentation where he explains how it works. So if you go and you look at the, like if you read the story about the moon landing and how Buzz Aldrin had to reprogram the computer on the way down, and the nouns and verbs terminology that they use in that, he explains how all that stuff works. And it's really seriously interesting how it works, because it's unlike any other computer that I've ever dealt with, personally. Now, maybe that's just how computers were back then. Could very well be, but it's not like anything I've ever used. And it's a fascinating talk.
What is it? DOS on steroids?
No, it's way closer to being a programmable calculator than it is to anything that any like a PC.
My scientific calculator in fucking high school.
Yeah, except the thing is, it's like that, except it can do multiple things at a time. And the problem that they were running into is that the system was getting flooded with data from one of the processes that was running. And as a result, it wasn't completing the loop on the other stuff. And the other stuff were little things like the radar altimeter. And so they were having problems where it's like, yeah, we can't land in this situation because we're not getting the information we need in order to land. And the radar altimeter on that bird was incredibly important, because there just was no depth perception. You couldn't tell, am I 100 feet up or 1,000 feet up? It was, there wasn't anything that gave you a proper sense of scale. When everything is a crater and you can't tell if it's a big crater or a small crater, you've got a problem.
Yep.
And so Buzz Aldrin basically had to reprogram it, and I think with his left hand, and I don't know if he was left-handed or not. He had to reprogram it on the fly to throw out the bad data, so that the bad data wasn't preventing the thing that they absolutely positively needed from completing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. So I think with that, we should probably call it a night.
Alrighty.
Chris, thank you very much for coming on the show.
No problem.
And I'm going to pull the thread on trying to figure out why, first of all, what source it was and why that source seemed to think those things about the Montana, because I'm very interested in where that came from. So I, expect a phone call from me at some point, and we'll talk about that.
Alrighty.
And hopefully on one of these trips back to Iowa, I'll get a chance to zoom up and visit you.
That'd be good.
The last time, you may recall, I was going to do that, but there was a little problem with like a really, really bad storm coming through.
No, the last time was a laptop that was a bulge.
The bulging laptop.
I think. No, I think. Yes, it wasn't. It was a laptop that the case had sprung off. It turned out it wasn't bulging, but this case.
Oh, okay.
But I think weren't those the same trip?
I don't think it was, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. Then it must have been the trip before that, because there was the trip. Oh, the trip before that, I don't think I was planning on coming up. I just ended up leaving town early, and you guys got slammed, and
we did.
Yeah, like several inches of snow, if I remember correctly, and like
heavy on the several.
Yeah, and it just sort of touched Des Moines. That was about it.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get any hail a couple of days ago?
Yes, and a thunderstorm in 12 hours.
So I didn't even know about the hail. The hail didn't hit Des Moines. It hit some of the outer suburbs. It didn't hit Des Moines. I didn't even know about the hail until the tow truck driver told me about it and said, yeah, they've been really busy dealing with cars that had hail damage. And it's like, oh, what hail damage? And it's like, yeah, the entire Midwest got slammed. The people at the auto body collision place said, yeah, we're up to our eyeballs. We can't even look at your car. Even if you told us right now, this was on Thursday, if you told us right now that you wanted an estimate, we couldn't even give you an estimate until next Wednesday, because they were dealing with all the hail damage. So. All right. With that, let's go ahead and call it. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Take care.
Bye.